Today is the death anniversary of Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi is an important figure in Indian history and is known throughout the world for his involvement in India securing their independence from the British Empire. And he's actually known in India as the father of the nation. He's probably one of the most quoted people of all time, but one thing perhaps that a lot of people have not specifically looked into are his views on procreation. In this video, we'll be doing a deep dive into this topic and trying to establish, was Gandhi an antinatalist? So the first thing to note is that Gandhi had 4 children. Between the years of 1885 and 1900, him and his wife had 5 children, but one of them sadly died soon after birth. Now, obviously this means that Gandhi wasn't child-free, but that doesn't mean that he couldn't have changed his views to become antinatalist after the birth of his last child. So what we really need to dig down into is, did he actually express antinatalist views? Now, before we get into the main bulk of this video, I'm going to make a couple of disclaimers. The first thing I want to say is that the quotes and research I present in this video are just the research that I have done as a layperson. This is not exhaustive research, and also the quotes and research that I have pulled up may exist in a context that I don't fully understand, and so may mean something slightly different to the interpretation that I'm putting across in this video. If anyone does know of any context that changes the meaning of any of these quotes, please do put it in the comment section, and all links and references to the original quotes will be in the description below, so you can find the links there. Another thing that's important to understand about Gandhi, and we will get into this later in the video, is that he seemed to have quite a negative view of sex, which often becomes entangled with procreation, as the time that he was living in, sex and procreation were not as separated by contraceptive technology as they are today. So sometimes in these quotes, it's hard to discern as to whether he's talking specifically about procreation or about sex specifically. Anyway, with that said, let's get into the instances of where it seemed like Gandhi was expressing antinatalist views. So perhaps the most widely circulated quotes of Gandhi that seems to have an antinatalist messaging is this passage from his discourses on the Gita. If destruction is violent, creation too is violent. Procreation therefore involves violence. The creation of what is bound to perish certainly involves violence. Now, that quote exists as part of a larger paragraph which you could see back there, but in this section, in this specific quote, Gandhi seems to be at least putting somewhat of an antinatalist point forward. And it's a point that a lot of antinatalists have made, in that creating another person, you create a being who will die, and they will exist in a body that will either slowly or speedily be destroyed by illness, accident, infection, or some other ill fate. And Karma, who's an antinatalist philosopher, actually links this quote from Gandhi to the wider ancient Indian principle of ahimsa. As a consistent proponent of the principle of non-violence, ahimsa, Gandhi cannot condone the bringing forth of new human beings who are all doomed to die. Another example is in a letter that Gandhi wrote to his son Manilal Gandhi. So in this letter that Gandhi wrote soon before he was about to be imprisoned, he gave some advice to his son on the topic of marriage, sex, and procreation. Please do not think that I got this wisdom after I had my fill of pleasure. I am simply painting before you the world as I find it from experience. I cannot imagine a thing as ugly as the intercourse of man and woman. That it leads to the birth of children is due to God's inscrutable way. But I do not at all believe that procreation is a duty, or that the world will come to grief without it. Suppose for a moment that all procreation stops. It will only mean that all destruction will cease. Moksha is nothing but release from the cycle of births and deaths. This alone is believed to be the highest bliss, and rightly. So Gandhi is clearly speaking in a negative tone here about procreation, applying that it is the source of destruction continuing. And he also links non-procreation with the concept of moksha. Now, if you want to learn more about moksha and how it relates to antinatalism, I'd highly recommend reading this book by Ken Coates, Antinatalism, Rejectionist Philosophy from Buddhism to Benatar, where the author dedicates a whole section on the relationship between moksha and antinatalism. And I'll include a link in the description for that. But from this video, I'll take a short section from that book on what moksha is. The essential concept of moksha is the freeing of the soul from its entanglement with the world. And going back to the letter where Gandhi gave advice to his son, it's not actually an isolated case where he spoke about this topic with his family members. In Gandhi's Passion, The Life and Legacy of Mahatma Gandhi, Stanley Wolpert explains that actually Gandhi never congratulated any of his family members when a new child was born. And this stance he took actually got pushed to the point where where it even caused family fractures. So Walpole explains, he went on to warn his son against procreation as well as marriage, arguing all the progeny born now are mean and faithless and continue to be so. Do not think that I want to bind you not to marry even after the age of 25. Manuel was 18. I do not want to put undue pressure on you or anyone. I just want to give you advice, though you are but a child. He continued to think both of Harilau and Manuel as children, despite their maturation, plagued as he was by feelings of guilt over his carnal lust that led to the birth of both older sons. Harilau had already married and fathered a daughter, for which Gandhi viewed him as mean and faithless. Even from the distance of London, he attempted to save Manuel from a familiar fall. Regrettably, despite his saintly goodness and brilliance, Gandhi never managed to probe the dark roots of his irrational puritanism, which haunted and obsessed him until the end of his life. That it poisoned his relations with at least one of his loving sons is certain. He never congratulated any relatives on the birth of a child. To his nephew Shaganlal's wife, Kashi, who had just given birth to a daughter, Gandhi wrote from London, "What shall I write? If I say that is good, it would be a lie. If I express sorrow, it would be violence. I would only say and wish that you learn to control your senses." And just so you can see it in full for context, here is his letter to Kashi. "Though it is very late now, I needs must write to you today. Every week I remember you and Santot. What shall I write to you about your having given birth to a daughter? If I say that is good, it would be a lie. If I express sorrow, it would be violence. According to my present ideas, I should remain indifferent, for that one must have the mental equipoise described in the Gita, that no doubt is difficult to attain. However, my effort is in that direction. Meanwhile, I would only say and wish that you learn to control your senses in the right manner. I'm having plenty of experience as I go on observing my ideas become firm." So this seems to suggest that at least for a period of time, Gandhi took an anti-procreative stance that was strong enough to cause rifts in his family. And there was also another angle to Gandhi's anti-procreative stance as well, and that was one of resistance. In this letter to Charles F. Andrews, Gandhi actually expresses a wish for the cease of procreation in this current miserable state of India. As to chastity between husband and wife, I do not carry on any propaganda. It is too sacred for preaching. But with me, the thing is more than a pious wish. If I could find a way to stop procreation in a civil and voluntary manner, and whilst India remains in the present miserable state, I would do so today. But I know that is impossible. At the same time, I may tell you that the effect of that article was not inconsiderable. Now, obviously, this wish he's expressing to stop all procreation is dependent on, as he puts it, the present miserable state of India. So it's conditional. It's not the antinatalism that we understand. But the fact that he frames the solution to a problem in terms of non-procreation seems to support the idea that he at least had some antinatalist sentiment in his thinking. And this link that Gandhi had made between non-procreation and the dire state of India has actually also been picked up upon by Stanley Walpole again in Gandhi's Passion, the life and legacy of Mahatma Gandhi. At this very time, when actively engaging in removing wounded bodies from fields of battle, Gandhi's thoughts turned furiously in the direction of self-control. It became my conviction that procreation and the consequent care of children were inconsistent with public service. Now, this is interesting because most people see having children and the consequent care of those children as just a natural part of life that just often just happens to you. It's just something you do. But for Gandhi, he understands it to be a trade-off, that if you choose that path, you are trading off the time and energy that you'll be putting there with the time and energy that you could have put into things like social service, making the world better. And another reason this is interesting is because there's an attitude in India that is different from the West that I came to learn about through the process of making this video. In the West, we often have a cultural attitude towards, especially politicians, that if they have children, if they are a family person, this is good because we see them as someone who is relatable and someone who has a buy-in into society. They've had children, so they are bought into society and they hope it goes well. Whereas through the process of making this video, I learned that there's a cultural attitude in India that sees politicians and leaders who haven't had children as actually being more committed to make the country go better, because you are sacrificing the opportunity to have a family and to have children in order for you to spend your time and energy improving the state of the nation, which I thought was one really interesting because people outside of India might not understand that context, but also it gives context to this quote of Gandhi's that even when he was in South Africa, this cultural influence from India was still influencing his thinking. And a similar case can actually be found in Gandhi's own work, Self-Restraint versus Self-Indulgence, where he doesn't advocate for non-procreation as a means of alleviating the situation in India, although that might be part of it, but to prevent forcing people into a dire situation. Is it right for us who know the situation to bring bring forth children in an atmosphere so debasing as I have described. We only multiply slaves and weaklings if we continue the process of procreation whilst we feel and remain helpless, diseased, and famine-stricken. Not till India has become a free nation, able to withstand avoidable starvation, well able to feed herself in times of famine, possessing the knowledge to deal with malaria, cholera, influenza, and other epidemics, have we the right to bring forth progeny. I must not conceal from the reader the sorrow I feel when I hear of births in this land. I must confess that for years I have contemplated with satisfaction the prospect of suspending procreation by voluntary self-denial. And shortly after this passage he also writes, I have not the shadow of a doubt that married people, if they wish well to the country and wanted to see India become a nation of strong and handsome full-formed men and women, would practice perfect self-restraint and cease to procreate for the time being. So again, these passages only express a conditional form of antinatalism. Essentially, that conditions are so bad in India that we should temporarily cease procreation, one, so that we don't exacerbate these issues, but also so we don't force new victims into them. Again, the fact that Gandhi is thinking about solutions to this problem in terms of non-procreation, which many people would not, suggests that he at least has some antinatalist sentiment in his thinking. Because even in these circumstances, many people will continue to procreate, as they have done throughout history. So moving on, in 1924, Gandhi again brings up the link between moksha and non-procreation in a discussion that he was having with G. Ramachandran. The third question that I would like to ask you is whether you are against the institution of marriage. I shall have to answer this question at some length. The aim of human life is moksha. As a Hindu, I believe that moksha is freedom from birth, by breaking the bonds of the flesh, by becoming one with God. Now, marriage is a hindrance in the attainment of this supreme object, inasmuch as it only tightens the bonds of flesh. Celibacy is a great help inasmuch as it enables one to lead a life of full surrender to God. What is the object generally understood of marriage, except a repetition of one's own kind? And why need you advocate marriage? It propagates itself. It requires no agency to promote its growth. But you must advocate celibacy and preach it to one and all. Yes, then you fear there will be an end of creation. No, the extreme logical result would be not extinction of the human species, but the transference of it to a higher plane. Now, this back and forth here is a bit of a complicated one. So, in the traditional understanding of human extinction, that there are no more Homo sapiens on the planet, Gandhi doesn't seem to fear this, and he maybe even advocates for it if the breaking of the bonds of flesh means a cease to procreation. But this could also be interpreted by understanding the achievement of moksha in this life, rather than by not creating more life. This is explained again in the book by Ken Coates, Antinatalism, Rejectionist Philosophy from Buddhism to Benatar. The essential point here is that action has to be disinterested, i.e. free from desire. When one acts without desire, the action is not binding. There is no karmic accumulation. It is performed in the spirit of inner detachment, such that one acts but without any expectation of rewards. It is a form of renunciation in action. Through such action or karma yoga, the cause of suffering, dukkha, the craving or desire, is destroyed and one achieves liberation. So with this context, Gandhi could be saying two different things. So the first option is that he does advocate celibacy, but except in cases where sex is specifically intended to cause procreation, which he does seem to endorse in his writings, which we'll get onto later. And as a result, humans won't go extinct as we understand the term, but everyone will achieve liberation in this life through disinterested action. The second interpretation could be that he does advocate full celibacy, and humans will become extinct in the sense that we understand it, that there will be no more humans on the planet, and it's that our souls will exist on a higher plane in moksha. You can make of this quote and the interpretations what you will. I will leave it up to you. So as well as moksha, there's another ancient Indian concept that Gandhi relates to non-procreation. That's the concept of Brahmachari. The ideal Brahmachari has not to struggle with sensual desire or desire for procreation. It never troubles him at all. The whole world will be to him one vast family. He will center all his ambition in relieving the misery of mankind, and the desire for procreation will be to him as gall and wormwood. So Brahmachari is the path, practice and lifestyle that one follows to achieve liberation. And what's important for this specific video is that Brahmachari involves the strict control of one's desires and impulses, and includes a strict adherence to celibacy, i.e. non-procreation. The Encyclopedia Britannica explains Brahmachari as the following. Brahmachari in Buddhism, strictly the practice of sexual chastity. More generally, the term denotes the endeavor of monks and nuns, as well as lay devotees, to live a moral life as a way to end suffering and to reach enlightenment. So going back to Gandhi's words, it seems that his advocacy for non-procreation here is not in the traditional sense of antinatalism, that it's out of a philanthropic concern for the individual who will be created, but that it seems to be actually centered around the potential procreator as part of a wider effort of their spiritual self-restraint and progress towards liberation. But it's an interesting one because in a more spiritual sense, it could be considered a form of antinatalism if it had the right messaging. So if this messaging was aimed at everyone as opposed to a specific group of people, it would advocate a message of non-procreation for everyone, which for all intents and purposes would look quite like antinatalism. It just wouldn't have the same motivations that we are familiar with in the modern day. And it's worth noting that there were actually a variety of interpretations as to who this path to liberation was open to. Some people thought that Brahmachari was something that everyone could pursue, and others thought that it was only open to certain groups in society. And so whether or not this messaging ultimately ends up in a more universal non-procreative message really depends on the interpretation of Brahmachari that that person operates under. So I think that's a good, decent general overview of the antinatalist sentiments in Gandhi's thinking and his writing, and it seems that his advocacy for non-procreation is grounded in a few things: spirituality, resistance, ethics, and perhaps there's even more. Now I want to move over to some examples where it seems that Gandhi's thinking and writing actually conflicted with antinatalism, or at least didn't seem congruent with it. So in a letter to Sita Gandhi, who I think is Gandhi's granddaughter, he seems to be congratulating her on the birth of a child. And that actually runs counter to what we heard earlier about Gandhi never congratulating family members on the birth of a new child. I got your postcard. You must have received the letter I wrote to you. May you live long and be a sincere worker. It is a matter for joy that Vasant has given birth to a son, and that both mother and son are well. Now, one important bit of context here is that you might have noticed the date on this letter is the 23rd of October 1947, and India got its independence from the British Empire on the 15th of August 1947. As we already know, one of the reasons that Gandhi advocated non-procreation was in resistance to the dire state of India, part of that being the foreign domination of India by the British Empire. So this could be why he's now speaking favourably about an act of procreation, because it's happened in a free India. Another example of Gandhi's thinking that seems to at least have friction with an anti-procreative stance is that he was very much anti-contraception, which is an unusual position for someone who doesn't want people to procreate to hold. So here's an example of a letter he wrote to an organization that promotes contraceptive use, and he didn't speak about it in particularly positive terms. The article on continence referred to by you was written by me, not because I believe that India was overpopulated, but because I believe that self-restraint was good in every case, and much more so at a time when we were ourselves in a state of slavery. I am totally opposed to artificial means of controlling the birth rate, and it is not possible for me to congratulate you or your co-workers on having brought into being a league whose activities, if successful, can only do great moral injury to the people. I wish I could convince you and your co-workers to disband the league and devote your energy to a better purpose. You will please pardon me for giving my opinion in such a divisive manner. I have not hesitated to do so because I know something of such activities in England and France. And I think this goes to show just how intertwined Gandhi's view of procreation and sex are, because Gandhi promoted celibacy, and it seems to me that if someone promotes celibacy but also opposes contraception, then their promotion of celibacy is more to do with sex than it is procreation. So it seems to be that Gandhi is actually the opposite of a lot of modern antinatalists who say that sex is okay if it doesn't lead to procreation. And Gandhi says sex isn't okay unless it leads to procreation. And this is what we get onto next. And that's the final thing I want to show that I think counts against Gandhi being an antinatalist, is that throughout his writing, there are fairly common references to him condoning procreation in certain circumstances. Procreation is a natural phenomena indeed, but within specific limits. A transgression of those limits imperils womankind, emasculates the race, induces disease, puts a premium on vice, and makes the world ungodly. ungodly. A man in the grip of the sensual desire is a man without moorings. So here you see an example of what seems like an acceptance of procreation within specific limits. There's also relatively common reference in his writings to the condonement of sex only when it leads to procreation, which clearly antinatalists would not do. And you can see this referenced again in Stanley Walport's book, Gandhi's Passion, The Life and Legacy of Mahatma Gandhi. He struggled throughout his mature life to subdue his strong sexual desire, believing that intercourse with his wife for any reason other than procreation was evil. His antipathy to every form of violence, moreover, made him most acutely sensitive to the potential violence of sexual brutality. And a clear example of this is, again, in his own writings, Self-Restraint versus Self-Indulgence. It is good to seek causes for things, but it is not always possible to discover them. The desire for children is universal, but I do not know any convincing cause if to see oneself perpetuated through one's descendants is not a sufficient convincing cause. My proposition, however, is not vitiated if the cause I give for the desire is not found sufficiently convincing. The desire is there. It seems to be natural. I am not sorry for having been born. It cannot be unlawful for me to see the best in me reproduce. Anyway, till I see evil in procreation itself, until I see the sexual act for mere pleasure is justifiable, I must hold that the sexual act is justified only where there is desire for children. So for antinatalists, at least as it exists today, there's an acceptance of sex for pleasure and not procreation. But Gandhi has the opposite. He has a rejection of sex for pleasure, but for procreation he accepts it. So I think that all shows a decent overview of Mahatma Gandhi's views on procreation and shows that they're very complicated. And this obviously isn't exhaustive research on Mahatma Gandhi's views on procreation and the ethics of it. If anyone has anything to add or anything to disagree with, then please put it in the comments below. But my conclusion is that it seems clear to me that Gandhi wasn't an antinatalist, but more that in certain contexts and instances he expressed antinatalist sentiment. It seems clear to me that his rejection of procreation was heavily intertwined with his rejection of sexual desire and sex itself, but also the dire conditions that India was in. But also peppered throughout his writings were instances of an acceptance or even a celebration of procreation. So clearly his views were very complicated and they changed over time, but I think it's clear that we can't call him an antinatalist. Anyway, let me know what your comments are and I'll see you in the next one.